Hi, everyone. Let me just share my screen. Yeah, okay. So yeah, thank you to Khaki for inviting me. Thank you to everyone for showing up on a Saturday evening. So yeah, I'm Thomas Manuel. I'm a journalist. I'm a writer based in Chennai. And last year, I wrote a book called Opium Inc., like Farooq said. And today we're going to basically I'll try to talk to you about the opium trade in general, Bombay in particular, and then kind of like build out from there to like some other interesting things. So yeah, all of this is kind of based on my book, which came out last year from HarperCollins. Should be available at every good local bookstore. But yeah, uh, I I find that when I talk to people about the opium trade, there is kind of sometimes there is no, like, people don't know that it happened at all. So what? So in case, like, if you're already aware of the opium trade, then like indulge me for 5 minutes as I kind of do a small introduction to why I was excited to write this book and why I thought it was important. So uh, at its peak, the British government, their third highest source of revenue after land and salt was opium. And when this, and land and salt are kind of like imprinted into our social and cultural memory, right? Lagan is like a great example of sort of unfair land taxes being used as a story. And you know, if you watch the movie, if you haven't watched the movie, you kind of know that, oh, you know, there were like these onerous land taxes, and you know, they were a major source of revenue for the British. Because of the salt march, that kind of iconic salt march that Gandhi did, we have this idea that, oh, there were these kind of exploitative like salt taxes, and we have this idea that they were like a part of the national movement was kind of like protesting the salt tax. So why do we not know about opium, given that it was probably as important in the 19th century as these things? Like, why has it been forgotten? So at its peak, there were about 1 million farmers cultivating opium in India. Opium is from the poppy plant. It is you grow poppy and then you harvest kind of a sticky sap from the poppy bud, and that can be like processed and turned into opium, which is which is a narcotic. It has kind of like addictive properties, and it is like 1 million farmers growing this over 500,000 acres of land stretching from, say, Agra to Bengal, this Gangetic, the Gangetic plain, right? Like this is a huge number, and it is genuinely surprising how quickly something so important to the Indian economy, something so like fundamental, has been forgotten. Like Farooq said, the idea that cotton was like a major trade good is again kind of like well known. In Bombay, that's understandable. Like cotton has this kind of physical imprint, right? Like the cotton mills led to like mass migrations into the city. Like tens of thousands of people came for cotton, and then when the mills shut down, like there's a lot of Bombay specifically has a lot of kind of social change attached to cotton. So it's kind of understandable that it looms so large in that city's kind of like memory and understanding of itself. But Bombay seems to not have any kind of cultural memory about the opium trade. And this again has good reasons for it. It is not like an accident. It is a part of a process to kind of like forget this. And the reason we've kind of forgotten is because even though this mass production of a drug happened in this country for at least 100 years, um, the negative effects weren't felt here. The drug was grown in India and and exported. Um, it was such a major element of our exports for for many years. It's 25 to 30% of like everything we're like exporting in the 19th century. Um, so because domestic consumption was not high, the fact that we produced and sold this, and when we say we, I mean Indian farmers, but it was the British government that was kind of hosting this. The fact that this huge scale production of a drug was happening in India is kind of is sort of like an awkward detail from like history that we want to forget. But opium plays like an essential role in how colonialism happened in India. If you think of colonialism as, if you think of the Indian colony that Britain had, and it's not a guarantee that project was going to be successful. When the British invade India, when they start turning it into a colony, like they face a fundamental problem, which is like, it's very expensive to conquer places. Like armies cost money. And so you invade and you conquer, and you need to find a way to recoup that investment, right? Like you're only doing this, while they might have sort of like talked about some civilizing mission or something like that. I mean, I think it's we can all agree that is was like a thinly veiled kind of like excuse, and that it was primarily done for wealth. But it was not clear where you're going to get that wealth from. Like you can sack the treasuries of like Mughal kings, but like then it's over. Like, why do you stick around? Like, how do you continue to like extract wealth out of this nation? So there is this. So this is like this very, very provocative line that Carl Trockey, who's an American historian, who's written a book about the opium trade. He says, without opium, there would be no empire. Like that's a big statement, and I quote this in the book. Like I kind of try to like this kind of strong stance is what I'm trying to communicate. Like I don't think of myself as a historian. Like I'm a journalist. I try to convey to people ideas that historians have been kind of like talking about. Like I try to take it from this academic setting and I kind of say it in a nice way that is engaging to read, is like fun to kind of to learn. And that's what we do at India Inc. as well. Like that, this whole idea of like communicating history and kind of making it accessible. So yeah. So Carl Trockey says, without opium, there would be no empire. So what does that mean? Like why was opium so central to the British Empire existing in India? So there's this Chinese Indian historian named Tan Chung, and he named his name for this system that existed is he called it the Great Opium Triangle. And the idea is that Britain had a problem in the late 18th century, where they were obsessed with tea. They had kind of discovered this new substance called tea, and it had become a national drink. It was being like adopted en masse across the country, and they just needed as much of it. They were importing as much as they could. But the thing is, there's basically at that point in time, there was one country in the world that had tea. There are various kinds of tea, but this very specifically what was referred to as tea at that point of time was only in China. So there's this really interesting kind of like study, like this detail that has kind of has come out, which is basically like all tea comes from China, basically, if you trace it back in history. But depending on whether it came from China's west coast, like over the sea, or whether it came over land, the word for tea in that culture will either start with a ter sound or a ch sound. You know, chai is the kind of companion word here. But like basically in like every culture that has tea, it usually they have either the word for tea is either starts with ter, cha, and that is basically decided whether it came by ship or came by overland. So yeah, so the British had like become obsessed with tea. It had become this national drink. Like a part of the thing that makes tea so popular is also the availability of sugar, which is something that I will get into. But there's a whole chapter in my book in the kind of connections of these various products. But yeah, so tea becomes an obsession, and Britain is importing it as much as possible. Basically, they're like as much as they can afford to import from China, they're doing that, and like there is a market for it. But the problem is, China doesn't want anything in return. China is a huge market. Obviously, even at that point of time, British are like, there is this huge market in China. They have so much wealth, but they refuse to buy anything from us. Like we want tea from them, and Britain was like, oh, maybe we could sell them mechanical goods. Maybe we can sell them these clockwork objects. Like we've got all this technology. Maybe they'd be interested in that. And China was just flat out not interested. China wanted currency. They wanted silver. And this was a huge problem in Britain, because basically they were running out of physical silver. They were importing so much tea from China that their reserve of silver coins was basically running out. So what we might call like a balance of payment crisis, right? Your imports so far exceed your exports that you are you're literally running out of money with which to like buy things, and not people, right? A country. So on one hand, this is Britain's problem, that they need to keep importing tea, but they're running out of silver. And on the other hand, they have this other problem, which is that they have this colony in India, which they are kind of like expanding, and it's expensive, and they need to figure out a way to make it keep making money for them, right? They've conquered some small section of it. They want to conquer the rest, but how do they fund those wars? Like they need to make this colony profitable. They're thinking of it in that sense. And this in the mind of the British Empire, opium becomes an answer. So basically, there is this historically, opium has been grown in India, like even before in the Mughals, at the Mughal time, there was like opium was grown. It's a local crop. It was not maybe mass produced, but it was available. There are all these stories of the Mughal emperors, Shah Jahan, Jahangir, like all of them sort of like enjoying their wine, enjoying alcohol, enjoying opium, like potentially being addicted to these things. It's hard to know for sure, but there are all these kind of like in the memoirs of the court from that time, there are all these kind of statements that Jahangir was an opium addict, and they used to eat it with sweets and things like that. So the British realized that there is a huge market for opium in China, because right now there is a small trickle going. The Dutch East India Company has been sort of buying a little bit of opium from Calcutta and exporting it to China, exporting it to Southeast Asia. So there's this kind of trickle of opium from India to China, and the British realized that the market in China for this drug could be much greater. So slowly, like as this trade increases, they realize we need to expand production massively. So they start an opium department. There is a government department. It's the East India Company, but it's also the government at that point. It's Company Raj. So they start an opium department. They create factories. Amitav Ghosh's book, the first book in the Ibis trilogy, kind of starts out in an opium factory, right? Which is this, the hundreds of people, men, women, and children, kind of like working, taking it from sap to to the final product. But yeah, so they set up these factories, like they, through the government, they're advancing money to farmers. They're setting up this system in the kind of Bengal, Bihar area. And it works. Like as much opium as they can produce, China is buying. And opium then, it solves their problem. Like they don't need to pay silver to China anymore. They can give them opium in exchange for tea. But the end result, as far as India is concerned, is that Indian farmers are growing opium, and through that process, and the British are just buying it from. They have a monopoly on it. They know, like the farmer can't sell it to anybody else. So the Indian farmers are growing opium, and through the East India Company monopoly on it, Indian farmers are basically funding the colonization of this country, right? I mean, it's not just like I say this not to put the blame on farmers. In fact, the blame for Indian colonization is far greater on the Indian mercantile class, who were lending money to the British to basically fund wars and things like that at this point. Like historically, like even a local Indian king, like if they want to conquer a country, like fighting, like wars cost money. And so they would take loans from bankers, and these bankers were happy to lend money to the East India Company as well. I mean, the East India Company, they was said to be even better at paying loans than paying back their loans than local kings. So basically, this is the Great Opium Triangle, right? The British got tea from China, China got opium from India, and India got colonialism from the British. Like this was the system that was in place, and it was very neat, and it worked, and like it worked out well for the British, but India and China less so. But yeah, with that context, let's get into talking about Bombay. So there's this idea, right? Like I think I assume a lot of the people here are from Bombay, but even if you're not, this idea that like Bombay, like I think even I've said this at various points in time, like Bombay was like a wedding present, right? Like Bombay was a possession of the Portuguese, and when a Portuguese princess, Catherine of Braganza, gets married to British prince, Bombay goes as a wedding gift. But the idea is that like a better way to think about it is the wedding is just the way to kind of solidify like an actual like political like contract, right? Like there's the Portuguese want the English Navy's support, and the English Navy is basically like charging a price for it, and one of the things they get is Bombay, and the wedding is just a way to seal the deal. But why I bring this up is because for us, what's interesting is that Catherine of Braganza is the one who popularizes tea in Britain. Like in Portugal, they're kind of drinking it already at this point of time, and so when she goes to Britain, she kind of makes this a fad in the British courts, the aristocratic elite of Britain. They start mimicking the Queen, and from then on, it kind of trickles down to the rest of society. So there's a poem called On Tea, and one of the lines is, "For the best of queens, the best of herbs we owe." So at this point in time, right, like this is when the East India Company, I think, get a lease on Bombay from the British prince for like £10. That's the price they pay in the late 17th century. And there's a very funny story about how when they arrive, the Portuguese don't know that it has been transferred to Britain. So the British soldiers who have come to take over Bombay basically like starve outside the fort, catch malaria, and die. But I mean, it's tragedy, but it's also kind of amusing. But basically, the idea is that up to the beginning of the 19th century, you have like messages from like people like Lord Cornwallis and people like that complaining that Bombay is cash flow negative. Like it is a cost. Calcutta is the shining city. Calcutta is generating revenue and making money for the empire, and then we're spending it on Bombay. Like Bombay is a drain on our resources. But after 1830, that's not the case anymore. Bombay Bombay is always a trading city, but after 1830, Bombay's exports were up 6 times. Bombay's population, like there's this explosion. So what happens? Like what is this? What is this event that takes place that between these two phases in Bombay's life? I mean, there are obviously multiple reasons, but for this talk, I will focus on one thing, which is the legalization of opium. So we have just got to Bombay, but we will take a quick detour to what is now Madhya Pradesh, but historically was known as the Malwa Plateau. When people talk about the Maratha Confederacy, like it was not just Maharashtra, right? Like there were various Maratha kingdoms in this kind of Malwa Plateau as well. And basically, at the beginning of the 19th century, Calcutta realizes that people in Malwa, these Maratha kingdoms, like people there are growing opium and they are exporting it to China and undercutting this self-declared monopoly, right? They're driving down prices. There's rumors that the Chinese prefer Malwa opium. It has a different taste to it. So there's this kind of anxiety in Calcutta at this point of time. Like, there's this illegal, like they don't control this. They have not conquered this yet, right? Like the 1880, the Anglo-Maratha wars are not over. Like this is before all that. They've not conquered this, and they're like, this is illegal. They are like, we have declared this monopoly, and they are like they're smugglers. They're criminals. But so at this point in time, there's so they try to stop it. They ban opium. They say, like, you can't grow it. I mean, you can't ban something on land that you don't control. But anyway, they tried. But so what's happening in Malwa at this point in time is zamindars, traders, whatever they are, basically money lenders, zamindars are kind of like advancing money to farmers, kind of forcing them. Okay. The question of coercion is complicated, but the idea is that they are making farmers grow opium, and then they are setting the prices, etc., etc. Farmers, like, there's this, like the way the moneylenders would kind of do this is that you advance money, like to the farmer, you say, this is how much opium you need to grow. And then when harvest time comes, like all the moneylenders sit together, they calculate how much opium has come, they fix their buying price post facto, and then they make some changes in a ledger, and they tell the farmer whether they've met their target or not, right? Like this is the question of literacy, like the question, like, this is a free market, but free is heavily in scare quotes. But yeah, this is happening. This kind of like indigenous capitalism is happening, where like opium is being grown here, and like going out Malwa, being exported through mostly like Portuguese ports, Dama and Diu, sometimes Gujarati ports as well. But yeah, what happens is in 1820, the British decide that this banning thing has not worked. They're just going to try to become the biggest buyer of opium. They're going to just, like, whatever opium is grown in Malwa, that's fine. Like, they can't stop that. They will just buy as much as they can. Like, they will buy everything that is available for sale, because they have deep pockets, right? And then they will handle the export. And that doesn't work out so well. So there's a small story here that comes from a book called Smuggling as Subversion. In 1822, the East India Company has an agent in Bombay whose job is to buy opium from these kingdoms in Malwa, that is, whatever they're producing. And there's a market rate and things like that. So this Indian trader, I think his name is Premji Purushottam, he reaches out to the East India Company and he says, I have a certain stock of opium that I'm willing to sell you at 75 rupees per panseri. Like, panseri is a is a metric, is like a measure, is a quantity. The current market price at that point of time is 95 rupees. So this is substantially less than the market price. So the East India Company like says, oh yeah, we're very interested. Please reach out to our agent, a man by the name of Taylor. Like, you know, like Mr. Purushottam, please reach out to Mr. Taylor, and like he will like give you the money to buy this. Taylor hears this, and he's like, oh wow, 75 rupees. Like and he stops buying from the open market. He's like, I'm going to wait till, and he's waiting for Purushottam to get in touch with him. And at this point of time, Purushottam has no plans to get in touch with him. Purushottam is basically buying up all the opium in from Malwa that he can, and he's driving up the price, and it reaches 105 basically. You know, and then by the time Taylor realizes that there is no trade coming, all Purushottam was doing was kind of like getting him to wait for for this deal that was never going to come up. By the time he realizes that the market price has gone to 105, right? And Purushottam like is planning to export this himself. So it's this idea that the British were like kind of out of their depth here. Like Indian traders are kind of they're no match. You know, like you cannot just have like three guys here and try to like run a monopoly. So basically they go through this period, they try to negotiate treaties with the kings themselves. They don't do free market. They instead go like, the East India Company will sign a treaty with this kingdom that, you know, that they will sell their opium only to the East India Company and things like that. That does not work. It's just another kind of like 10 years of like wasted time. But by 1830, they decided it's not working. Let's just legalize it. Like, let's give up this monopoly. And the thing they do is they say that if you pay a certain kind of transit duty, right, like a small charge, like you can export it from Bombay. And they set up like infrastructure to support that. They have these weighing scales, and like specifically they make that transit duty just low enough that it's cheaper to export it from Bombay than like smuggling it to like whichever port you were doing that, right? Like they're doing this kind of competitive pricing, and it totally works. Like, as it's now simpler to export from Bombay, it's cheaper. Of course, everyone's going to do it. So opium starts flooding into Bombay. It stops going anywhere else, and there's now so much wealth in Bombay. Not just going to the government, going to Indian traders, financiers, shipping agents, like all the opium stock that was going to all these ports is now concentrated in one city, right? Bombay's gain. Bombay booms. This, like I said before, the population triples. Like exports go up 6 times. Like this is a huge moment in Bombay's financial history. Yeah. So, but there's a kind of the point of the talk, though, just because this is a kind of heritage organization, like my angle into this stuff is not heritage specifically. Like I am more interested in like the commodities and products and like thinking about money and materials and things like that. But there is this legacy, all this wealth, this immense wealth that comes into Bombay. Like that legacy is like still visible. Like it funds the physical infrastructure of the city that is still visible like 200 years later. Like you are like walking past it every time like you go to like South Bombay and things like that. And I will talk about just a few things. These are common examples. These are possibly things that you already know, but like I will kind of like get into some of the greatest hits, and then if you know, if you have any further questions, we can get into some of the less common, less well-known things. So yeah, we have talked about this man. Jamsetji Gigi Boy is the biggest name in this. Like mid 19th century, around like 1830, like he is like widely regarded as this great man, right? Like this huge, a hugely important trader. He's a Parsi trader, and like my book, the origin of my book is writing about this guy. Like I wrote an article about him in the Hindu's like Sunday magazine, and like it was the reaction to this article that kind of like I expanded on this article into this entire book, right? And this book is not about Gigi Boy alone, but he's the base. So the idea is that he becomes one of the uh, wealthiest men in India. I think there's some huge numbers thrown around, but the idea is that like his wealth is something like 40 crores. This is mid 19th century. It's an obscene amount of money, right? Like he basically retires at the age of 40 and things like that. He's the first Indian to be knighted. He's knighted in 1842. That's not enough for him. He's like, I want a hereditary title. I want a title that will pass down to my children. So he becomes the first baronet of Bombay, right? Like he's Sir Jamsetji Boy, Baronet of Bombay. Like his house in Musgaon is called Musgaon Castle, like, because that's how the British understand these things. So yeah, he's an opium trader. Like he is on a ship as a young man at 2021. He's on a ship going to Canton in China, which is hijacked, captured by the French, and he's kind of like, as one of the people on the ship, he's like thrown into the cabins or whatever and along with him is this kind of surgeon's assistant, this again another like young man named William Jardine, and they kind of like become friends in the kind of the hull of the ship in this darkness as prisoners. And Jardine just happens to found an opium trading firm in China, and along with his partner Matson. And Jardine Matson is still like it starts as an opium firm, but it's still present today. It's a $40 billion company. And Jardine and Matheson just become the richest. Like they make so much money. They go back to Britain. They buy themselves castles. Like there are stories written about them. They're called I don't know who it is, but I remember somebody refers to Jardine as Mr. Druggy. Like there's this kind of they have this own mythology that they build around themselves as these people who have gone to China and become so wealthy and come back, and how do they make their wealth through opium? So the thing, but how Gigi Boy is remembered today is like he retires at the age of like 40 years, I said, and he decides that he's going to devote his life to philanthropy, right? And his name is now like all over Bombay, like roads, flyovers, and this, but it kind of starts with this hospital. The idea is that in the 1830s, there's this thing called the Bombay Native Dispensary. Like it's an attempt to like provide like medical care to this like city that is growing so much. And there's this like Gigi Boy like writes to the government and says like, no, we should have a full-fledged hospital. And the government at that point of time, Grant, at one point, who is the Governor General of Bombay, is also planning this medical college. So there's this idea that like, oh, we can combine these two things. But what is interesting is that this hospital, like people know, I mean, his name is on the hospital, it's very famous. People kind of like know, they know his initials, they know he built this hospital. But what's interesting is that there's this kind of tension between the British and Gigi Boy, where he is like, he wants his hospital to be built around caste class lines. Like he's like, oh, there should be a separate kitchen for Brahmins. Like they can't eat food. They need to be separate wards, like, things like that. And the British are kind of are like, oh, no. Like our whole thing is that we ignore these divides that you Indians have, whatever. This is like just a small, interesting detail to complicate our understanding of the charity that is happening at this point of time, right? Like these are not kind of like simple sort of issues. Another thing that bears Mr. Gigi Boy's name is the JJ School of Arts. This is almost the last thing. Like he has this decade-long, 2 decades-long kind of like philanthropic career, right? Where like all he does is do charity, and he funds like many things. Like but like almost one of the last things he does is pay for the JJ School of Arts. It's interesting for many reasons. One of them is like Rudyard Kipling's father was the dean. So this is kind of the reason that he is born in Bombay, is because this institution exists. And Kipling, poet of empire and all that. And again, whether you like him or not is just an interesting detail. Also, the JJ School of Arts is sort of what gives rise to the progressive arts group, MF Hussain. The entire kind of trajectory of like Indian like modern art. There is this, like, it's hard to tell that story without this institution, right? It plays such an important role. Gigi Boy's wife, Ava Bai, who's also comes from a family of wealth, she has independent wealth. She single-handedly funds the Mahim Causeway, which connects Bombay at that time, separate islands. When it's high tide, there's water, kind of like you can't just like ride a carriage across or whatever. This leads to people like die in various tragedies, like because there is no bridge, right? There is no like linking causeway. So a Parsi contractor is building, is kind of like hired, and like Ava Bai says that she will pay for this. This is like 1.5 lakhs or something like that. Again, mid 19th century, huge amount of money. And there's some I've not verified this, but like there's some people who say that a specific detail that she asked for was that the Koli community who lived there should not be like disturbed in this process of this causeway being built, which is just an interesting detail to point out, given the Worley ceiling, which is solving the same problem that the causeway was built. But yeah, like this moment, like this is civic infrastructure, right? Like this is not like they were doing community level infrastructure. They were building charities for like Parsis. They were funding education. They were doing all sorts of things. They were, but this is the city itself, like vital infrastructure. This is a great example of that. But there are other things they paid for: waterworks in Pune and things like that. They build roads in Bandra. They connect various like landmarks there to like help people get around. These are again two other figures from that time. They are Gigi Boy's business partners. Muhammad Ali Roge is a Konkani Muslim, and he's again from this upper class aristocratic like Muslim family. Like they are into shipping. Like he's probably been to China like 10 times over his life. Probably double the number of times Gigi Boy was there. And like Gigi Boy becomes this representative of the Parsi community, Roge becomes a representative of the Muslim community, and these are opium traders. This is the primary way they make their wealth is opium. Like when the British start appointing justices of the peace, like Roge and like Gigi Boy are like first in line and things like that. There is in 1851 there were the Muslim Parsi riots, which was very basically the official cause at that time was a Parsi magazine drew a picture of Muhammad, but like is so often the case, while that might have been an instigation, there's clearly some kind of like class tension. A lot of like working class Muslims are employed by in Parsi businesses, and they are kind of like, there is this kind of growing anger against like low wages and poor treatment and things like that kind of bubbles up into this riot. And there is this story about how Roge and Gigi Boy ride in a carriage together, kind of visibly to show that they need peace, right? Oh, here's a Parsi and a Muslim kind of like driving around together. but yeah, Roge, like during a drought in Bombay, 1825, I think he builds like this water tank uh, in the Camp Maidan, and like converting that number, it would be something like spending 2 crores to build that water tank to solve people's like access to drinking water. Another really interesting figure from this same kind of milieu is Rogerio de Faria, who's a Catholic Goan. He's also like an opium trader. He is less known, like he's not remembered very well, but he's also a very, very interesting figure. Like he supports. There is this kind of politics going on in Goa at that point of time where Portuguese, like white Portuguese, look down on local Goans. So Faria is a big supporter of Bernardo Perez da Silva, who is like a Goan who gets appointed to be mayor, and the Portuguese like don't accept it. So Bernardo like launches like a military like expedition to go and like forcefully take over, and it fails, and like Faria's like fortune is destroyed, and like Gigi Boy basically like takes care of him in his retirement, as you know, as he kind of dies in penury. The other kind of like important people I want to talk about are the Sassoons. So they are a Baghdadi Jewish family. They come to Bombay in the early 1830s. They flee kind of like violence in Baghdad, where they have been for generations. They have been bankers and treasurers to the ruler of Baghdad, and they, you know, in this kind of like violence, in these riots, they've turned into refugees and they have to flee, and they kind of decide to come to Bombay. They have business here already. Like Sassoon is he's basically a prince, and he's like this he speaks multiple languages. Doesn't speak English, but he speaks multiple other languages. And he decides that he can work with the British. He thinks of the British as being like a reasonable, like a people you can do business with. You know, that's his kind of attitude. So he comes to Bombay and he sets up here, and he has many children, and they basically rebuild in Bombay. They start with cotton, and they're kind of connecting. They're looking east. They're looking west, right? Like, which is they connect. They're connecting back to Britain. You know, their focus is on shipping from India to Britain, because they have all these shipping contacts with like Muslim countries like along the way and things like that, historical network. And they slowly, over the course of the next 30 years, they start eating into like this Parsi almost monopoly on opium. They start they break into this industry. They do it in a very interesting way. They basically copy the British method. They start bypassing this whole like network of like intermediaries, and they go to the farmers directly, start advancing them money, start kind of like cutting out the middlemen, and they, by 1860s, 1870s, they dominate the opium trade. They've taken it away from Gigi Boy, from the Parsis, from Jardine and Matheson, and over this time, like things have happened. Right? Two wars have been fought for opium. The entire economy around it has changed, and by the 1860s, like many Parsi opium traders have become cotton mill owners. They get out of the opium trade. They see prices fall. Supply has gone up so much. In China, they've started getting it from like other countries. So they get into cotton, and the Sassoons do as well. I think Jacob Sassoon at one point I think he's a grandson of David Sassoon, the patriarch of the Sassoon family. I think he at one point is the largest employer of factory labor in Bombay. These are two buildings that you might have seen, the David Sassoon Library and Reading Room, which is, I think, seems like it's very close to the Khaki office. But yeah, it's right now just it's a place. You can go and sit there and you can like read a newspaper and read books. It's just a walk-in library, I think. But it was originally started as like a technical like education center, like European uh, 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 were doing like kind of a polytechnic kind of college sort of thing, was like running institute was running out of here. That's what it was kind of built to do. And it's clearly like this very expensive building. Like it's built to kind of like rival government projects, right? It's like they hire like famous architects, and a lot of money is spent to make this. And again, it's a private citizen, right? Who's paying all this money to create this like institution. The synagogue in Baikula is again another like example, but this is much more common and normal, which is like these traders, these rich people, the elites of a community making something for their own community. Like Parsis are doing this, Muslims are doing this, Hindus are doing this, and like this is an example of like Jews doing the same thing. What's more interesting to me is when they are building public infrastructure, things we associate with the government. Things like the Sassoon Docks, which is built by David Sassoon's son, who's born Abdullah Sassoon, but anglicizes it to Albert. It's the first wet dock in Bombay. Basically, a wet dock is, as opposed to a dry dock, is a dock in which there is water all the time, like the ship is resting on water. And the idea is that it's again built to facilitate cotton exports. All the cotton mills that have been built coming up around this time. I don't know how common knowledge it is, but like India's cotton trade has this huge boom, partly because like the American Civil War happens, and all the cotton grown by African slaves in the South can't make it out of the country anymore. Like Britain has banned slavery, and they like stopped buying it from the southern slave owning states. So where they're going to get their cotton from? India. So like that is part of this global picture of how Bombay. So yeah, this is just a note to myself to point out that this charity, right, like all this infrastructure, roads, hospitals, colleges, like all these things that are being built and being operated not in profit-seeking ways, right? This is genuine charity. This is just a note for me to kind of point out how all of this is done, not in a transactionary manner, but like clearly with an intention of like, this is give and take, right? Like Bombay, unlike Calcutta, the Indian elite and the British have a good relationship. Like it's fundamentally different from any other state. There's this kind of sense of like working together. And this is how Indian like upper caste elites kind of communicated to the British that, we are like, we could be equal. Like we are like, we understand this idea of public service, this civilizationary, like we're on the same wavelength. Look at us doing all these noble things. And the fact that it was funded through what essentially is a drug trade, right? Like you are selling addictive substance to a country, and hundreds of millions of people in China are suffering, right? They're wasting away. Like opium has negative effects on the body. Like it is kind of economically, it kind of does huge damage to China, but also like on an individual person level, there is this idea that it is like destructive to the human body. This is all kind of like wrapped up in this idea of like charity, right? Like it is not, seeing it as just some kind of noble act is not the whole picture. The kind of last thing I will say, knowing that it's 7 o'clock, is that I will just kind of mention how the opium trade ends. Like the Congress, again, another institution that is tied to Bombay like very like closely. The nationalist movement is not the end of the opium trade. Like independence is not when the opium trade ends. In fact, almost all the nationalists at that point of time are like, let's not end the opium trade. It's a source of revenue. There's this whole kind of like war in the op-ed editorials of like various papers, right? I think there's a Hindu editorial from 18, I don't remember the date, but like they say like opium is a great evil, but like national bankruptcy is a greater evil, which is such a relatable kind of concept, like pitting morals against money. Like, so there's this idea that, oh, like people know that it's destructive, but this idea like what is good for the country, like, oh, we still need to do this, which is just interesting to compare to like the Congress's attitude towards like alcohol, right? Like alcohol prohibition is like a big issue, like a moral issue, but that does not extend to opium. In the end, opium trade ends because of broader global forces, like the League of Nations is created. There are all these treaties signed like internationally, like regulations are signed. China, like various other nations are looking at China and going like, how long will we let this exploitation continue? And there is a kind of international cooperation and agreement that happens that kind of like ends the trade. But yeah, I just point out there's a very interesting story. There's a whole chapter in the book about like nationalism and how it kind of like what they think about opium and things like that. Yeah. So with that, I am done. I managed to end at 7 o'clock. I'm very happy. But yeah.
Thanks, Thomas. That was wonderful. A lot of what you talked about, the Bombay connections and the philanthropic institutions, a lot of our audience members would be aware of. They would be probably walking the streets, but I guess it would have been of great importance to somebody who's not from Bombay. Let's look at the questions which have come in, Thomas. The first question is from Suki Bora. She wants to know that what prevented opium from being consumed in a much larger scale domestically?
It's a really good question. So the idea is that the British were not particularly like interested in selling domestically, right? Like they do, is being produced for a reason. It's being produced to be exchanged for tea. That said, there's a lot of evidence that farmers who were growing opium were inadvertently getting addicted to this substance, right? Like just in the process of harvesting, like you take a knife, you cut the bud to extract the sap, you kind of lick the knife to make the next cut, and this kind of like, but the one big exception to that is like when tea plantation becomes a big thing in Assam, opium is being sold to the laborers. Like the plantation owners like sell opium to the laborers as a way of kind of getting them making the sort of like 12-hour back-breaking labor kind of like easier, just it kind of takes away the pain, that kind of thing. But yeah, basically it was never really meant for domestic consumption. Yeah.
Jennifer Hose, who's going to be a speaker very soon, she's attending. She mentions that there is still a big opium factory in Ghazipur. Is there?
Oh yeah, that is Ghazipur. And I think Benares were the two historical opium factories. Yeah, I think I'm not sure, what remains there. Opium is still technically legal in India in the sense it's controlled. It's a controlled substance that only certain people can grow, but it's still being produced here. So that's a really interesting detail.
Our guest Shrikant Yati mentions that that factory was built in 1820. Okay. I have another question over here. Why did the opium trade via Calcutta not thrive as much, even though moving opium via the Ganga would have been cheaper than land transport from the Malwa Plateau? Oh no, the Calcutta opium trade thrived. I don't know if I gave the sense that the Bombay trade was bigger than the Calcutta trade. No, I was just focusing on Bombay. Calcutta, the UP, Bihar, Bengal, that swath of land is the largest producer of like opium in the country. That's why I said like 1 million farmers, 500,000 acres. Like that's all happening there. And that is like official. That is government controlled. That's a different system. So we always hear of China being a partner in the opium trade. Were there any other markets which were tapped by the British? A question from Arnavaz. So no, I think basically the opium trade is almost always pointed at China. It is sold in other places.
Southeast Asia, places like that. But by far the largest quantity goes to China. Like there is, like it's produced in other places as well, but like, yeah.
Okay. And in your book, somebody who's obviously read your book, Supriya Arun, she says that in your book, you attribute the present-day poverty in UP Bihar belt to the opium cultivation of those days. Can you expound a little more?
So that is, it's a like, it's a very hard thing to draw like a causal line and say like this is what caused something. But there's one academic who has written kind of persuasively that basically in areas where the British saw the land as just something to exploit, right? Like they were like, this is opium territory, we'll grow opium on here. They did not invest in schools, in hospitals, like in these like areas. And the long-term effects of that is that like you can basically still feel the long-term effect of that in like something like the poverty of Bihar. But yeah, drawing those causal lines is tricky.
So you mentioned opium and we talked about cotton too. There's somebody who wants to know from you why indigo didn't create as much wealth as opium did.
Indigo is also like an important crop. It again has this very exploitative like history. Like there is a lot of violence like in indigo production. But and yeah, it was a very lucrative crop for sure. It just it just never reached the sheer size of this because it didn't have this kind of captive market. Right? The idea is that the British created this market in China. It wasn't. There's nothing particular about China that that makes it a natural port of call for opium. The British, to some extent, addicted that population. Like Chinese had banned it; it was illegal there. Yeah.
It's nice. It's so nice to see this camaraderie between our speakers. Jennifer Hawes says that she's posted a picture on your Twitter feed, a poppy tail.
Thank you.
Let me look at further questions which have come in as we were talking. There is a view by one of our audience members, guests, Shirin says that this is in reply to Rajneesh's question about why indigo did not create as much wealth. Shirin's response is because indigo is not addictive.
Yeah, there is a big difference. Yeah.
Rajneesh says that Egypt also made a lot of money in the cotton boom, but lost its sovereignty. That's also an interesting story on them. I think that's another topic for another day.
Yeah, yeah.
And again, Jennifer's comment is that indigo was more for UK consumption, whereas opium was connected with what she calls country trade, the triangle between UK, India, and China, which was way more profitable. Nambirajan says that you shared about Tatas and the initial days in the opium trade. Did you? I don't remember you talking about the Tatas.
No, I didn't mention the Tatas, and I think their involvement with the opium trade is relatively minor. But yeah, they also had various other business interests with the British. Yeah.
There's one thing which we constantly grapple with at Khaki. Most of our guests, their eyebrows reach their hairline when we talk about all this wealth coming in from illegal trade, you know, hands covered bouts and say, oh. And how do you view that? How do you tell people that that was a different age when certain things which were considered okay and even respectable are not respectable now? These differing timelines, how do you bring that into the paradigm?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Like opium at that point of time is depending on where you are, depending on what context you're in, either it's an ordinary commodity, like Bombay newspapers will quote opium prices like it's just a thing that you can write, right? It's like a stock, like a commodity, like you would just note something extremely ordinary. And you could say that prior to the British turning it into a mass market commodity, it was also extremely ordinary in India in the sense that it was like a folk product, right? Like it was people. I think even today, people will take some poppy when they need to sleep and things like that. I know in Kerala there's this thing of like, oh, I can't sleep, like I will take some of this. Like it's there in terms of like folk medicine as folk remedies, like opium is there. Like these things, like there is no fundamental property of these substances that makes it good or bad, harmful or harmless, right? Like anything by the old adage, anything in excess can be poisonous. So yeah, like I think it's an interesting question, and the basic way is like you can think of it from a modern day perspective. Like today also there is this broad movement to decriminalize drug use, right? For us to like think about like to rethink what we think a drug is, right? Like, you know, and they talk about alcohol versus like drugs and things like that. There is this conversation you can have today, and you can talk about like historically how it was seen, in what ways it was normal then, and what. But yeah.
So Shauryanju, that answers your second question about how opium consumption was perceived. We have another guest who wants to know if you can highlight a little bit about the Scindia connection with the opium trade. Did the Malwa province extend to the Scindia lands as such?
I think so. Like I think they did produce opium, but I don't know much more than that. So yeah.
Nupur wants to know what piqued your curiosity to cover Mumbai when you are based out of Chennai.
Yeah, so Bombay is just like one part of this broader story, but it is like a very important part. It's like an interest. It's Bombay and Calcutta, right? Like they're the two like focal points of this. So yeah, I'm writing an Indian story, and yes, Bombay happens to be a central figure. Like Madras has very little to do with the story in general. Yeah.
Curious architect Isa Sheikh wants to know what is the status of the opium market today?
I mean, right now, like there is an opium market, like that is in case that's not clear, but like even there is, you'll hear two words now, like opiate and opioid. An opioid is a synthetic, not synthetic, but basically it's not made from opium. It has no connection to the poppy or whatever, but it is another kind of drug that binds to the same receptors in your body that opium does. So there are various synthetic drugs, and so these drugs are extremely harmful, extremely addictive. There are like there is the opioid epidemic in the US, as it's called, which has been extremely destructive there. In Punjab, we have an epidemic of our own, which some of it is opioid, some of it is opiate, which is things like heroin, which does have some connection to like poppy and opiate. But yeah, it is, of course, it's like illegal.
Did any of the trade go westwards? Is a question from Abhishek. Was there any connection with Afghanistan?
So Afghanistan did grow opium historically, and today is considered the source of most of the illegal opium in the world. It's a way that one of the ways terrorist organizations raise money. But there is also like a very good, very controversial argument that the idea of like funding terrorist organizations using drug money is something that is tied to like imperialism and like the interventions by the CIA and things like that. But yeah, opium pre 19th century and things like that, like is just like a medical substance, right? You can buy it across the counter in Britain. Like it is the basis of like many medications throughout history. So yeah, there was some Western trade, but they regulated it in Britain long before they decided that it was illegal to export to China. So it's just another example of that hypocrisy. Yeah.
So was there any collaboration between the Parsis and the Jew families who were involved in the opium trade? Arnavaz asks.
so they're competitors to some extent, but they're also collaborators just in the sense of like both being part of Bombay Public Society. So you'll see the Sassoons and the Parsis kind of like, you know, being part of the boards of some institutions together and things like that. But yeah, primarily these are distinct communities and were mostly competitors. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting question from Jennifer Hose again. Were there also, it's not a question, it's more of a comment. She says there were opium houses in London too, in that period.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, a typical picture you have in your mind of an opium house is slanting roofs and half awake Chinese people, but yes.
Yeah, there's a very kind of like, there's a lot of scaremongering that happens in Britain around like these opium houses and things like that. It's like there's a lot of like racist kind of like propaganda about like opium coming to Britain and things like that. And you know, while that might have been true there in terms of that picture of the dingy like opium house, in China, for example, like opium houses there could be like very elaborate. Like in Shanghai, you would have these like brightly lit, like the way you would imagine like an elite restaurant, right? Or like a tea house, right? Like, you know, beautiful chandeliers, like ornate, like wall work, like well lit, a public space. Like it's not necessary that there's nothing inherent about opium that makes it kind of like a dangerous kind of thing that, you know, has to be in some kind of dingy setting. Okay.
And I think what we have is now the final question from Pratik. He says that just like Sidney Mintz has written an economic history on sugar and how it vitalized European capitalism, is there any attempt to do the same for this commodity?
Yeah.
Or has there been any other serious economic history of the product except for Amar Farooqi's work?
Yeah, like Sidney Mintz's book like is something that I like reference, but like I have a chapter in my book where I connect this like opium triangle to cotton, sugar, and slavery. And the idea is that like these are all like systems that are intersecting with each other in like various ways, right? Like tea becomes such a big obsession in Britain because of sugar, and sugar is mass produced and becomes cheaply available to factory labor in Britain because of slavery. And you know, like slavery is tied to cotton, and cotton is again another connection to India. And when you get to that, there is Indian indentured labor, there's Chinese indentured labor. You know, like even after the transatlantic slave trade kind of like ceases, and when these laborers are shipped to like these Caribbean like islands and things like that and forced to do like plantation labor, they're Indians or Chinese, like opium goes with them, right? Like it's used again as a way of keeping them kind of like docile and allowing them to kind of self-medicate. Yeah. So my book to some extent is focused on the economics of it. So yeah, if you're interested in that, I'm also interested in it. It's the same. They come from the same place. Yeah.
So Nambirajan wants to know if you have any book recommendations.
On something specific or just in general?
On this topic?
On this topic, Amar Farooqi's book is academic, but it's very good.
And of course yours.
Yeah.
Please feel free to talk about it.
Yeah. No, I mean, I've been talking about it, but there's a Jennifer Lovell book about the Opium Wars, which I highly recommend. It's a very, very good book. So if you're interested in the Opium War, like she's a I think, I don't know if she's a historian or she's a journalist, but like that is a very, very readable book. So like if you can get hands on Jennifer Lovell's book, yeah, I recommend it. Yeah.
Okay. So I think that brings us to the end of our Q&A. Thank you so much for taking the time. I think it was quite an eye-opener in terms of the peripheral things around the trade, which you spoke about. So thank you very much for sparing your time. And thank you, audience, for being there on a Saturday. We hope you found it interesting, and we hope that you'll keep on following our social media feeds for future events and participating in talks, walks, anything that you can participate in. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.